So yes, I'm talking about sports video games. Given the popularity of sports in the world, it may not surprise you that there are lots of sports video games of lots of different types, whether it's professional American football, whether it's soccer, whether it's something like skateboarding or even horse racing. So I'm talking about actually a subgenre inside of what we might call a larger genre of sports video games called televisual sports video games, a term coined by game scholars Stephen Conway and Mark Finn, and I'll, throughout the course of this, explain what we mean by televisual sports video games. I've talked about this for a number of years now in front of a number of different audiences, and one of the things I've learned is that not many have experienced sports video games in the audience that I speak to, regardless of where I am. So I've often found it's useful to actually demonstrate some of this to show off what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm actually going to start with a brief video to set the stage and frame what we're going to be talking about.
In front of a standing room only crowd, this joint is abuzz with activity. It's Game 4 of the National League Championship Series between the San Francisco Giants and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Hi again, everyone. Matt Vasgersian. Welcome to our special postseason coverage of baseball on the show. With me are Eric Karros and Steve Lyons. And Steve, lots of storylines here as we approach the start of Game 4.
And you can see the results right there. It's been about what we'd expected up to this point. Very tightly played, very tightly contested series so far. It sits at 2-1 right now, but I've got a feeling it's going to take at least 6 games, maybe even all 7 games to decide a winner in this one.
Set for what should be a good one. Lineups and first pitch are next.
So this is when you run and grab your beer, right, and then you come back to play the video game. So this is that was a clip from Major League Baseball, the show 13, the most recent version of the baseball video game for the PlayStation 3. And there's lots of really interesting things in that video. Whether it's the graphical overlays that say National League Championship Series, whether it's the commentary, the dramatic music, even the language calling the game coverage, which is interesting considering it's a sports video game that you're about to play, and even that last line where it's like coming up next, right? So I mean, really kind of interesting language that's being used there, and it's what we might call the audiovisual language of television, right? It's meant to represent and to reflect what a television broadcast looks like, and a lot of sports video games do this. And so when we talk about televisual sports video games, we're talking about this subset of games that are employing this language, that are trying to look like television, that are replicating the experience that you might have of watching a game visually. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about these types of games, and here's just some examples, ranging from something as early as 1982 Television World Series Baseball to last year's Madden in the top, I guess your top right, with Phil Simms and Jim Nantz looking lovingly at each other. So it's one thing to say that sports video games look like television, and other scholars who've addressed it have used the theory of remediation, suggesting that television is in some way an older media form, that video games are then adopting those features and adopting those, and it is useful to think about it in terms of remediation to a degree, but sports is still viewed on television, and television is still a dominant mode for consuming television for sports fans, even as sports video games continue to grow and become also a dominant medium. And so to the extent that we make sense of these as contemporaneous media, not necessarily old and new media, we may need to move beyond just an idea of remediation and kind of look at the intertextuality between these two media forms in a different way. And so the focus of this thesis is the media relationship, and what I like to think of as a media relationship is how does television, which is still a dominant sports media form, and sports video games, which are increasingly growing in popularity, how do these relate to each other, especially with regards to these kind of aesthetics and the audiovisual aspects and like I said, audiovisual language of mediated sport, and so of televised sport. An important point on this subject is that and I was saying this earlier, Sports is hard to avoid in media, even if you're not a fan. It's in our news, it's on our internet everywhere you go. Sports, permeates every aspect of our mediated lives, and so it's increasingly difficult to talk about sports without thinking about it in terms of media, especially with regards to professional or collegiate sports. Suffice to say, it's useful to recognize that a relationship exists. But it's my intent with this thesis to actually take that further and interrogate this relationship in the context of a broader media ecology, right? In the context of sports media in general. There we go. To put this another way, it's the goal of this project to situate televisual sports video games and the relationship to television in a broader sports media ecology, while also looking at how these games reflect and reinforce dominant ideologies of hegemonic sports culture and hegemonic sports culture in North America. So really what I'm trying to do in this project is look at the relationship between these things and situate them in North American hegemonic sports culture. And I understand that hegemony is a particularly loaded term with some baggage, and so I promise I will address that soon. But I wanted to kind of address this and give you actually a sort of a presentation outline of where I'm going to be going. I'm going to address the academic discourse that I'm trying to engage in and engage with this thesis. And so looking at the scholars who have worked in sports cultural studies and the scholars who are working in fan studies and relate this work that I'm doing, looking at these two media forms to that. And also look at how scholars have addressed the notion of this sports media ecology, as we might call it. I'm then going to give you examples of televisual features that I looked at. I mean, there are lots of televisual features. Even in that short video, we saw a lot of things going on. But I'm going to address the news ticker or crawl that you would see scrolling across the bottom of the screen. I'm going to address, in part, commentary. I'm going to address also the notion of instant replay. There's also a curious case of a game called MVP Caribe, which I want to address, and it figures into how I'm conceiving of the notion of hegemony in thinking about the relationship and how to situate these things in the broader sports media ecology. And then some concluding thoughts about what's left to do still with this work. There is a group of scholars who have been looking at sports cultural studies, and they are doing so largely invoking the notion of this hegemony theory. And that is to say, they're looking at the power relationships that are taking place inside of sports culture. It's more than just a dominant part of the culture asserting that domination and asserting that on a weaker part. It's really looking at it as a site of cultural contestation or a site of negotiation. And this makes sense when you're looking at sports because sports, on the one hand, are locations where a lot of these dominant themes are contested and are negotiated and are kind of struggled with, and those power relationships are struggled with, but they're also sites where fans derive a lot of pleasure and take a lot of meaning out of their sports experiences. And so looking at these as negotiated spaces in this notion of hegemony theory is really useful for looking at this. Sud Jolly, Lawrence Wenner, David Rowe, and Mary McDonald are example of some of the scholars who have been looking in this space. And Mary McDonald has kind of categorized these sports cultural studies scholars as doing contextual cultural study of sports and kind of put them into a group together. And so it's in conversation with this kind of research and this kind of scholarship that I'm really trying to put this thesis. Sud Jolly has called the inextricable link that I sort of mentioned before between media and sport. That is to say that professional sport, for most fans of sport, is experienced in a mediated way. There aren't that many of us who play professional sports. I say us as though I do. And I promise you I don't. But the way that most fans engage sport is through media and also largely through television. But Sud Jolly has addressed this kind of inextricable link between media and sport with professional and then also largely with college now as the sports media complex. And And Lawrence Wenner has kind of used another term for this, calling it media sport. And this is kind of useful language to consider as I'm trying to position the relationship between sports television and sports video games in this broader ecology, and try to look at what are the ways that certain ideologies and certain ideas inside of sports culture are played out through this relationship. There are way too many dominant themes in even just North American mediated sport to try to list them all. And of course, these things are dynamic because they're all part of a historical context and given different times. But I'm even just listed a number here, and some of which have been addressed by some of the scholars listed above. Things like nationalism in sports and in sports media, violence, notions of gender, competition, race, commercialism, ideas of discipline, religiosity, labor. The body and corporeality and even quantification, right? A lot of these are themes that have been carried over and dealt with, and are also areas where there's struggle and, again, contestation and cultural contestation inside of mediated sport. And so, yeah, like I said, there's a lot of themes and a lot of spaces where this is happening. And so the goal of this project, or the approach of this project, is conducting critical readings of televisual features in sports video games. Like I mentioned before, things like the news ticker, things like the commentary, commentary, the news ticker, and instant replay are examples of these features that are shared by both of the media forms, and it's those features that I'm going to be looking at and conducting critical readings of. As I said, though, and this, a lot of this is informed by the fact that I'm a sports fan myself. It feels incomplete to me to merely take a critical look and a critical approach to looking at this relationship inside of this sports media ecology, because I also feel a sense and I feel an obligation to address the ways in which these sports media objects are also meaningful to fans and provide pleasurable experiences for fans. Mia Consalvo, Konstantin Mitkuc, and I conducted a couple of years ago, a study of sports video game players, a survey where we asked them about these experiences, and a lot of it is positive and pleasurable in a lot of different ways. And so there's this sense that I have, which is not unique to CMS, to look at the experiences of fans and how that works out and how media plays a role in these people's lives. And so it would not be enough to simply do a critical look for me. I want to kind of balance that with a sense and leaving room for how fans find meaning in this relationship. At the same time, it's interesting because there seems to be some kind of a divide inside of what we might call fan studies between people who study certain forms of media and people who study sport. Schimmel, Harrington, and Bielby conducted an interesting study that they called Keep Your Fans to Yourself, where they surveyed academics who were doing fan studies, both in popular culture. I like that there's a divide, in popular culture and sports, as though sports is somehow also not popular culture. But their findings suggested that there's not a lot of overlap and there's not a lot of cross-pollination between these academic communities in terms of the resources and the scholars that they look at as being foundational in developing theories for looking at fans of these domains, and also in terms of the publication routes for these scholars. And so, their takeaway was that scholars in both groups could benefit from a cross-pollination. And so it's my hope as well with this thesis to be kind of moving that forward a little bit, to be taking some of the ideas and progress in fan studies in other pop cultural areas and applying it to sports domains. So, sports video games, the news ticker. News tickers are actually pretty old. The first kind of real example of a news ticker can be traced back to 1952 with the Today Show. It was obviously kind of a very analog thing, holding up news information to cover the bottom of the screen. And interestingly enough, there is a lot of experimentation between 1952 and then, and not a lot of research or documentation talking about what that experimentation was. It's really hard to track down the story of the news ticker between that kind of identified origin in 1952 and the next really obvious space, which was actually around September 11th. So on September 11th, 24-hour news channels and even the regular network channels started using the news ticker to update people on what was happening during that day. And the news tickers never left. So you still see today on CNN and you see on headline news and all of these things, these dedicated news tickers. Well, sports were not too far behind, obviously, and so you see things, and this is actually from a recent video game, NCAA Football 12, I believe, with an example of the sports score ticker, what ESPN calls their bottom line. The ticker in sports video games is really interesting because on the one hand, people have developed fictionalized tickers that are displaying fictional information from a fictional simulated world of sports. So, in this, maybe Utah is playing West Virginia at 8 o'clock that day, but, you're playing the video game in August, and in the video game it's, December or something like that. But they didn't stop there. And while that is interesting and meaningful for sports video game players, they have also taken to putting just exact duplicates of the ESPN bottom line into video games. So scores from actual real-time events that are happening that day while you're playing the video game might be scrolling across the bottom of the screen. This is interesting because someone makes a decision about what populates that news ticker, and it's not always just sports scores. So on the one hand, you're getting information that says, okay, well, Utah's playing West Virginia, and this is what's going to happen. But you might also get information that that a certain athlete has passed away, or that a certain athlete was arrested, and someone is making choices about what information is populating these news tickers. So already there's a sense in which the information, the content you're getting is being directed and controlled by the people who make these sort of content decisions. Here's just an example of the ticker in a regular football broadcast. You can see how there isn't too much of a difference in the appearance between the video game and the sport. This is just an example of a ticker actually in a main menu of a video game screen, right? So it's not even just when you're playing the game, it's also just feeding you sports information while you're making choices about what you want to do in the game. And then here's another example, and what I really like about this is that the ticker has evolved to not just occupying the bottom quadrant of the screen, but also now we're being fed information on the sides of the screen as well. So really our real screen is being encroached pretty rapidly by these tickers. And a useful way for thinking about this has been the notion of framing, because one of the things that we see the ticker does is it frames the content that we look at on the screen. It really kind of informs our perspective that we take to the information that falls inside of the screen, right? There's the sense in which the sports information that flows across the bottom line ticker is creating a sense of this sports world through which you can then experience what's happening inside of the space. And so Anne Friedberg wrote The Virtual Window, which is a really great look at the notion of perspective in windows and frames from Alberti onto Microsoft Windows. And it provides a really useful way for thinking about the news ticker, and actually not just the news ticker, but a lot of televisual features in terms of how the experience and how the perspective is framed. And as I say on kind of the bottom line here, the crawl and the frame in a sports video game reinforces this notion of the identity role, that you're a spectator with agency. Right? Because if you're playing a video game that looks like television, you're controlling it, but in some ways you're also staying tuned for what's next, right? Like they said in that earlier video. And so there's this weird sense in which you've got this kind of, this role of the spectator with agency. So frames is kind of a useful way, and this is also another way of thinking about the way in which this relationship and this feature plays in the kind of dominant ideologies and hegemony of sports culture, because like I said, people are making decisions about what fills that news ticker and what fills that, and so they're also thereby making decisions about how your experience is framed and how your perspective on that space is framed by the content that surrounds it. That's an example of physical framing, but there's also kind of figurative framing, and commentators are a good example of actual figurative framing that happens that happens in sports. early TV commentators, it's another example of what some people might say is remediation, but early TV commentators were carried over from radio. So a lot of the same sportscasters who were doing radio calls had to adapt their calls and had to adapt their style for television because now they had a visual medium. And so at first it was clunky and not very good, but they learned how to do it and they got better at it. And one of the things that has evolved is that sportscasters have become these narrative framers of the experience of television, and I think this quote's a really good one. Sports broadcast TV's most memorable moments are given shape and purpose by the commentator's emotional call of them. And this is often the case, right? What you're seeing on the screen is really shaped by the way the commentators inform it. And that can be either you're buying what the commentator says, or you're disagreeing with what the commentator says. But either way, they're having a tremendous impact on what you're seeing. Well, of course, commentators have made their way into sports video games as well. On the right is, again, a picture of Phil Simms and Jim Nantz. They're the CBS football commentators. And they've been included, even their likenesses included, not just their voices, have been included in Madden NFL football. And then next to it, I bring up John Madden football, of course, because John Madden is probably best known for being a commentator, even though he was a really good football coach as well. So here we have a game, most people hear Madden actually, they don't even know he's a person. They just think it's a video game. But here we have a game that's built around the commentator's personality, which drives at another point that commentators have become, over the years, these personalities associated with sport. And especially as with cable, the diffusion of sports networks and the explosion of ESPN, we have the growth of this dominant sportscaster personality, which can dramatically affect and dramatically impact the way the experience of the sport is framed. Many of them are former athletes, that figures into it. There's also identity and brand identity associated with the networks and on what network they are. It's meaningful that the CBS sportscasters, even though it doesn't say CBS anywhere on here, are in Madden NFL football. It signals a certain kind of football broadcast for the Madden NFL football player. And so again, we have another example of the ways in which the kind of sports media ecology, that sports media industrial complex, is kind of reinforced by this relationship between sports television and sports video games. At the same time, commentators have become pleasurable and important experiences for fans too. They're seen as a linkage to a notion of reality and authenticity that people look for in sports, which is actually tied to the televisual and not so much the experience of actually playing the game. You're not generally looking through a football visor when you play a football video game, although such a thing has existed. So commentators are an example of a kind of a figurative framing of the experience, and they play a really pivotal role in sports video games. Just a quick note, I don't know how many have a quick note on this. In Television World Series Baseball, which is a 1982 game and credited as being the first graphical, as in the first baseball video game that had visuals, was developed based on an algorithm for a mainframe computer that had no screen, and the output of that mainframe computer baseball simulation was text, and the text was in the form of a sportscaster. So even before we had visual graphics, Don Daglow was designing this simulation to output sports commentators. And so even in Television World Series Baseball made use of Intellivision's voice synthesis module to have a guy say home run or swinging a long drive. So even as early as 1982, we get that. Say early as 1982, it's fine. So on to instant replay. Instant replay has been used in sports in a variety of different ways. It's been used in television since about the mid-century. The evolution of instant replay can probably be tied to highlight reel films and newsreel films that predate it. Not surprisingly, there's contested origins of instant replay, and when I tell you what some of the contested origins, you'll get a sense why. The popular U.S. Conception of the origin of instant replay is that a 1963 Army-Navy football game was the first example of instant replay on television. So dramatic, in fact, that people were calling the network and saying that they just scored a touchdown twice because they hadn't seen it and they didn't know what happened. Sources suggest and indicate, though, that George Retzlaff, a CBC Canadian Broadcasting Company producer of Hockey Night in Canada, which is a hugely popular Canadian sports show, was using kinescope technology to show replays before that, as early as like 1957, I believe, so predating it by a number of years. So interesting that there's these kind of contested origin stories. Obviously, with the evolution of tape, VHS, and then also digital video instant replay evolved and became ubiquitous in sports broadcasting. It's used on the field too, in some sports more than others. But there's a great shot of the NFL football referees looking at instant replay, and it's having an impact on the way the game is played in the field. But it's become something that is naturalized into sports broadcasts and totally accepted. The earliest and most common, and this isn't a really early footage, but a good example of some of the earlier instances of examples of instant replay in sports video games is actually user control. So it was less of a televisual kind of aesthetic where it cut to an instant replay in the middle of the game, but that you could pause the game, pull up an instant replay, and kind of control it to see that awesome thing that you just did. But that's interesting in its own way because it puts you in this kind of dual role of, on the one hand, broadcaster and game player. But of course, instant replay has evolved as well, and so now you'll see over the course of a sports video game play, it will cut away to images of a slam dunk, of a home run, or of a really vicious tackle. And again, turning to the ways in which sort of kind of powerful themes or dominant ideologies are kind of reinforced and reflected in this relationship, we have to look at what is the choice of what gets replayed. And some producers are making decisions, and it's obviously cultural, but there's decisions about what is being replayed for the audience and what is being shown. So we often see things like violent hits being replayed, which reinforces this notion of violent sports, especially in football and hockey. And that's actually an area of specific struggle and contestation right now, as we're learning more and more about the kind of injuries that athletes are receiving, but it's still the thing we get shown. It's sensational. Home runs, the notion of the exceptional play is often replayed as well and shown to you again, this notion of exceptionalism, of superb ability. Blunders and errors. I have apologies to every Red Sox fan in the room, but the image of the ball rolling through Buckner's legs or the mistakes, the kind of schadenfreude I guess we enjoy in seeing other people's errors and mistakes. So obviously there's decisions, and this plays out in sports video games as well. And of course it ties with the commentators. When you see an instant replay in Madden NFL football of a very vicious tackle, and they talk about how vicious and violent that tackle was, you're experiencing a similar thing that on the one hand signals TV, and on the other hand reinforces these kind of ideologies. There's some interesting things that happen with replay as well with regards to the interactivity. And just a quick note, so Madden in 2009 had this rewind feature where it would cut to a replay with, at that time, Chris Collinsworth talking about what happened and dissecting it and saying, well, this is where they screwed up, or this is where things didn't work right. And you could press a button to rewind time, and then play the experience again after having watched that instant replay from the commentators. And so this is an interesting affordance where some of the televisual features are kind of adapted to the affordances of the interactivity of video games and used in kind of a unique and interesting way. So MVP Caribe. I bring up MVP Caribe because, as I sort of mentioned, looking at this relationship with regards to how cultural contestation and kind of negotiation of power relationships is happening, MVP Caribe ends up being a really interesting case. MVP Caribe is a game that is a modification. People take an older game, MVP Baseball 2005, that was released by EA. They take a PC version of this game and they hack it. They replace a lot of the files in the game, they modify it, they do an almost complete game overhaul except for the kind of skeleton underneath. And the group that's doing it is a Latin community that cares about Caribbean League baseball, because that's the experience of baseball that they have. But the sports media industry, sports media industrial complex, does not provide a Caribbean League baseball game for that group. And so, left behind, left out by this industry, they've taken it upon themselves to hack this game, modify it. They even record Spanish language commentary to show how important that is. You can even see it's like Caribe TV up in the corner, which is great, right? And they put in all of these markers and signals for an experience of baseball that is theirs and it's ones that's authentic to them. And so this, to me, is a really great example of the ways in which people are subverting the games and on the one hand, finding great meaning in the televisual design of these games and the relationship between television and sports, but then also negotiating a lot of the things that are points of contestation and struggle for their community and for their culture in redesigning this. And so MVP Caribe, I think, is a really interesting case. Some thoughts, some sort of final thoughts about what's next and where I think this also needs to go. This whole project was actually born out of a desire a couple years ago when I was first thinking about it, of wanting to talk to sports fan communities and find out how this relationship was meaningful to them and how it worked out for them. Because of the scope of the project and putting this together, I couldn't quite do a project where I focused on the fans themselves and talked to them, but I actually think that this is immensely important. We need to talk to the players of these games and the people who are engaging with them to find out in what ways are these meaningful, in what ways do they struggle against some of it, in what ways do specific communities find value on one hand, but then also have to kind of work against things with this version of mediated sport. And so I think, and again, I say sports fan communities because I sort of cringe and react to the notion of a kind of totalizing sports fan. There's as I even seen there's many different fans of baseball, many different kinds of baseball. So I think addressing specific fan communities who play these games and play specific games to find out how that works. And then there's also the question about what happens as televised sport changes. What we're seeing is, I was even talking with Sunny Sidhu about this earlier, we're seeing that the ways in which people are experiencing mediated and even what we might call televised sport, which kind of addresses a little bit of what Katie was talking about too, in different ways. I watch baseball mostly on my iPad now, with the streaming app made available by Major League Baseball. People watch gamecasts. It sounds strange, but it's literally there's no motion except for maybe the trajectory of a ball. It's all statistics. It's an interesting kind of loosely interactive data visualization of a baseball game, but fantasy baseball players love it because the information is all right there in their hands. So the ways in which we're engaging sport is changing. The way televised sport is being delivered to fans is changing too. And so then the question becomes, what happens to sports video games if a lot of their relationship to television is now kind of changed by the way television changes? It could also be the other way. It could be part of what's influencing the change of television is the other side of the relationship, the way in which they're looking at what video games can do. And actually, discussions with some developers suggest that as well. So this is stuff that was unfortunately unable to be addressed in this thesis, but areas that I think really need to kind of be taken once we get a strong handle of what's sort of happening in this space. As the last speaker, I want to thank you all again, and perhaps to butter you up, and as a congratulations, I'll just leave you with, go